Okay, folks, we have our next guest in the studio, and we're going to get our other guest, Eric Draitser, on the line. But we're going to start off with our first guest, who is here in the studio with us. And we're going to talk about the world leaders, some of the world leaders who appeared at the United Nations General Assembly's annual gathering of world leaders in 2015. And it had quite a lineup in its general debate. The leaders of Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, and the U.S., among others, were headliners. And we're going to have an overview of the United Nations that celebrated its 70th anniversary. The United Nations, a world body that in fact has been, we should say, financed and shamelessly controlled by the United States. But we'll get into that later on. But joining us to discuss this geopolitical analysis of the U.S. quest for global domination are Eric Draitser, whom we will get on the line shortly. He is the founder of StopImperialism.org and Counterpunch Radio that he hosts. And we have here in the WBAI studio with us radical journalist Caleb Maupin. Welcome to the program. And while we are getting Eric Draitser on the line, let's start with the speech with you, Caleb, of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who called for, quote, an international coalition against terror, like the anti-Hitler coalition, end of quote. A proposal that one would imagine would be welcomed by the U.S. since it has had a dismal failure with the training, equipping, and arming of so-called moderate insurgents in Syria that turned out to be a complete disaster that in the end, many have argued, only served to help ISIL that has expanded its grip inside of Syria and consequently the region. Today, Russia conducted its first airstrikes inside of Syria after receiving an official invite from the Syrian government, which is more than the United States had. In addition, the Federation Council of the Russian Upper House approved the use of Russia military force for airstrikes inside of Syria, but not boots on the ground. Russia, unlike the U.S., is attempting to operate inside or within the boundaries of international law. But the U.S., in my opinion, insane logic, in fact, have already started their complaint about how the Russian military action is in fact not targeting ISIL, but in fact the enemies of Bashar Assad, which is kind of odd. So how do you distinguish his enemies from the ISIL forces?
Well, in listening to Putin's speech, it began almost like every other speech with references to 70 years ago when the United Nations was founded. And that was really a glorious moment in history when the United States and China and the Soviet Union, they came together to defeat fascism. And it was really a glorious moment in history, and we're in a similar position geopolitically at the moment. However, at this time, unfortunately, and especially disturbing to people like me here in the United States, is that right now it's the United States that is aligned with the forces of fascism around the world. Whether that's, these Takfiri insurgents in Syria that are beheading people, recruiting children and doing horrific things, whether it's the Saudi monarchy, which just has a horrific human rights record and is just spreading terrorism and destruction throughout the Middle East, or whether it's open neo-Nazis like in Ukraine that are in alliance with Poroshenko in the government that was installed by the U.S. So it's really a fundamentally disturbing global situation. where the entire world is just really, outraged about terrorism and the spread of violence around the world. But it seems that the leaders of the United States seem to be aligned with the terrorists against the people of the world who are striving for peace and democracy.
But it's very clear, even U.S. military officials and others around the world who are not necessarily critics of the U.S., but in fact are critics of Russia, have all agree for the most part that the U.S. equipping the moderate insurgent forces have been a complete failure. The U.S. has spent $500 million on training and arming the insurgents, who, for the most part, have turned the weapons over to ISIL, joined ISIL, and the Russians stepped in, and of course they have their own geopolitical interests, but the U.S. seems to want to have its cake and eat it too, because Obama clearly said that we welcome everyone in this alliance. But today they're complaining that, in fact, the Russian military strikes are again against the enemies or the insurgents working against Assad.
Well, every single day, the Turkish government allows trucks to cross its border into ISIL-controlled territory full of supplies. And if you look at who ISIL is fighting against, they're fighting against the government of Bashar Assad, which the United States has been trying to overthrow for decades. They're fighting against the Shia community in Iraq, which is loyal to Iran. In Yemen, ISIL is fighting against the people of Yemen who are striving for independence. So everywhere ISIL goes, it is only fighting people that the U.S. is also opposed to. And ISIL has actually gone as far as declaring, quote, "God has commanded us never to attack Israel." Who is ISIL really serving? And does the U.S. really want to defeat ISIL? I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the way Afghanistan is now, you look at the way Iraq is right now, and you look at the way Libya is right now, you can see that the result of U.S. intervention is chaos and instability. They never make the conditions better for the people, and the U.S. policy in Syria is not designed to bring peace or stability or improve people's lives. It's designed to destabilize the country, reduce it to chaos. And that's what we're seeing play out. And Russia, on the other hand, actually does want to defeat these Takfiri insurgents and bring peace to the instability to the region. And there's a fundamentally different motive behind U.S. policy and Russian policy.
Joining us on the line is Eric Draitser, who is the founder of StopImperialism.org. He is a geopolitical analyst, and he also is the host of Counterpunch Radio. Eric, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Nellie.
Okay, Eric, what we are talking about, and we just discussed the Russian airstrikes in Syria that commenced today, and already the U.S. government is complaining that, in fact, the airstrikes are against the enemies or insurgents against the Assad government. How can one distinguish who's who in this melting pot of terrorists? And we know that many of the insurgents, supposedly armed and financed by the U.S., have defected to ISIL. So help us to sort through this.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because essentially the United States is trying to make the claim that that Russians are attacking so-called legitimate opposition. But if you look at the actual U.S. policy and some of the words and statements that have come out of Washington, even in very recent days and weeks, you begin to see quite obviously that what the U.S. really means is many of the terrorist factions that don't technically identify under the Islamic State umbrella, they consider to be legitimate opposition, legitimate insurgents. Lest we forget David Petraeus on Capitol Hill testifying before Congress that the U.S. policy should be to arm al-Qaeda, that is the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. That is literally a policy position from a major segment of the consensus in Washington, the political establishment. And so when they're making this claim about the Russians, there's a very real question as to whether or not they're actually referring to real battle-hardened terrorists. And yes, absolutely, the distinction, the delineation between so-called Islamic State, al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda factions, and many of the other so-called the Islamic Army of Conquest, and all of these various groups, this alphabet soup of factions, all of them, really, the delineation between them is somewhat irrelevant. They are terrorist elements, plain and simple, and they are actually armed and funded and trained by the United States and their regional allies. This has been documented by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Reuters, many others. The Brookings Institution recently released a policy paper entitled Deconstructing Syria, which basically said that the U.S. should dismember the country for the purposes of allowing these terrorist factions to occupy and control various enclaves. This is what the United States is really upset about vis-a-vis Russia, namely that Russian airstrikes against terrorist elements in Syria are completely destroying U.S. plans for regime change. Ultimately, regime change has been the goal. That's what the U.S. has been striving for 4.5 years, and they're hoping to achieve it by hook or by crook, whether with terrorist factions or whether with a destabilization and subversion. The Russian involvement now makes that impossible, and it is forcing this conflict towards a peaceful resolution of political dialogue and compromise. That's been the position of the Russians and the Syrian government, and that seems to be where this is headed, and that's why Washington's apoplectic about it.
So we want to cover a number of issues here. So let's turn our attention to China for a moment. The president of China appeared to have, I saw this, set the stage for the speech of President Vladimir Putin by rejecting U.S. claims of hegemony in his short speech. The president of China said, quote, "The future of the world must be shaped by all countries." And he added, quote, "China's vote in the UN will always belong to the developing countries." That cuts right through the heart of U.S. claims of hegemony in the region. So give us your thoughts about China's president's comments, because clearly these leaders were sending a message to Obama and his administration. Caleb.
Well, the U.S. media often portrays and kind of describes in detail problems of corruption and things that go on in China. But if that's the case, if the U.S. media is really concerned about it, they should really love Chinese President Xi Jinping, because he is leading a crackdown on corruption. The mass line campaign that he is leading inside of China is really an attempt to really kind of revitalize and restore the principles on which the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949 of selflessness and egalitarianism, and trying to restore those. And especially internationally, he's also fighting for those principles. His dream of a new Silk Road, of countries developing and not exploiting each other, not getting rich at another's expense, but mutual cooperation between nations, building up, and the idea that world peace is based on economic development, that the reason people are killing each other and there's so much instability in the world, that's really rooted in poverty and scarcity, and that if a global economy can be built up and people can have jobs and livelihoods, things can improve. If you look at what China and Iran are working on in Afghanistan, while the U.S. is saying the way to stabilize Afghanistan and fight terrorism is more drone strikes and more troops on the ground, the Chinese and Iranian plan for Afghanistan is to build railroads and to develop trade and transport and let Chinese businesses invest in Afghanistan and really just build up the economy. That stability in the world is really based on people having jobs and healthcare and education. That seems to be the vision that President Xi is putting forward, and that seems to be his message, that the way to bring peace is to provide people with a decent life. And I think that's something fundamentally great, and I really have great admiration for him. And what he said at the UN was really magnificent. And the other thing that he said is, he said, the worth of any plan
plan is in its implementation, meaning for years the UN has gotten up and talked about, we're going to feed the people and stop starvation, but it's never come to pass. Things have gotten worse, especially in Africa and Latin America. So, it's up to the UN to actually carry it out. And China's vision of a unified world, a world where not one country, not Western bankers rule the world, but that every country has a say and is treated fairly. It's a beautiful vision. It's a beautiful Chinese dream.
So, Eric, just let me ask this in relationship to the role of the United Nations that has a pretty sordid history of collaborating with the U.S. in its quest for global domination. I mean, we can go back to the Korean War, and we can talk about the overthrow of many governments, and we can talk about invasions and rarely, if ever, any condemnation against the U.S. Invasion, coups, regime change, anything that you want to name here. So, and now we hear Poroshenko talk about how Russia needs to have its veto power stripped away. So let's put this in context in terms of the United Nations and its role in the collaboration of the U.S. In its quest for global domination.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to add real quick in response to what Caleb was saying. I agree with everything that all the points he made, but I would also add that while Xi Jinping was making a lot of high-minded statements about cooperation and everything, there was a subtext in his speech, clear and unmistakable subtext directed at the United States and at its Western partners in the neo-colonial imperial system, namely that China will continue to represent those developing countries that want to have economic relations. China is a major player in Africa, where the United States is desperately trying to block Chinese economic cooperation with its military, with AFRICOM, with drone bases, with all of the military architecture that the U.S. has been building. It is an attempt to block China and Chinese development on the African continent. And so when Xi Jinping goes before the United Nations and says that China's vote belongs to the developing world, what he's actually saying, the translation of that is that China represents a viable alternative to the U.S. hegemonic system. Those countries in Africa know it. The countries of Central Asia and Southeast Asia know it. The rest of the world is beginning to realize that multipolarity doesn't simply mean the diffusion of power in various parts of the world. It means a viable alternative, political, economic, and military, to Western hegemony. That's a major point, and that dovetails with what you're getting at there, Nellie, specifically regarding the United Nations, because for too long, the UN has really been the lapdog of the United States. We can see that in countless examples. Even recently, we've just been talking about Syria. The UN's lack of action to try to find the real facts on the ground almost led to a war in Syria in 2013, when the U.S. was screaming from the mountaintops that Assad had gassed his own people using chemical weapons. UN weapons inspectors who had been there, who had found no evidence of such a thing. None of this was really discussed. The UN didn't play its role as an arbitrator. If anything, it abdicated its responsibility so that it wouldn't upset the apple cart, so to speak. We can point to a number of other examples where the UN really has acted as the de facto partner of the United States rather than as a disinterested arbiter. So when Poroshenko talks about stripping Russia of its veto power, what he's actually talking about is desperately clinging to a hegemonic system wherein the United States and the French and the British, the European system generally, are able to continue to dominate the United Nations, because increasingly China and Russia, as well as other developing countries, but especially China and Russia, who are on the UN Security Council, have become more vocal. They've stepped in. They have used their veto power multiple times to block wars in Syria. They have been more adamant in their position positions regarding international law being followed in the UN. And Poroshenko, it's really interesting that he would make that argument because it goes against the very founding principles of the United Nations, which was a balance between world powers, maintaining an equilibrium and a balance that would make essentially a new world war impossible, where there would be, to use the phrase of the U.S. So-called founding fathers, a checks and balances system. And the veto power in the Security Council is specifically designed to do that. It is to prevent any single power or any bloc from exercising its agenda and being a hegemonic power globally. The fact that the UN Security Council is becoming more democratized, where power is now splitting and these countries are not able to come to a consensus on wars, this is a good thing. This is preventing wars. It prevents the UN from acting as a rubber stamp for global conflict. That's what Poroshenko is objecting to, because it undermines his very position, which is create a war between Russia and the West, the most dangerous position anybody could take in the world today.
All right, we only have a short time left, so let's try to cover two other issues, and let's start with Obama's speech. Caleb.
Well, Obama's speech was just a call for war. I mean, it was a coded message, and it was a rallying cry for World War III. It was hate Russia, hate China, and it was really, really horrendous. And if you really look at it, Obama's speech really, it incarnated the fact that the U.S. economy at this time has really become centered around destruction. When you have a prison industrial complex where big corporations are making money not from providing people with jobs but locking them in prison, when you have a huge military industrial complex making money from war and death and destruction, when so many arms are being sent from the United States to regimes like Saudi Arabia so that they can spread death and destruction throughout the world, when so many people here in the United States can't find a decent job, the Midwest is deindustrialized, a rising police state, our civil liberties being stripped away, the U.S. economy is based on destruction, and Obama's speech really articulated that, and the hope lies with the countries that are breaking out of that system and trying to develop something new.
Well, what caught the attention of many people with respect to President Obama's speech was this quote. The U.S. Washington's purpose was to, quote, prevent bigger countries from imposing their will on smaller ones, end of quote. Now, this is by far monumental hypocrisy. Your comments about that, and we're going to move quickly from this because we want to deal with the issue of Cuba and President Raul Castro's speech. But Eric, quickly, your comments on this.
Very quickly, I would say not only is it monumental hypocrisy, it is a coded warning, not even really coded, a threat to China and to Russia. In regards to China, this is a direct threat regarding China's policies in the South China Sea, in its territorial waters, in its sphere of influence. It is a direct threat against China vis-a-vis the Diaoyu Senkaku conflict with Japan. It is a direct threat against China in Southeast Asia because China tries to act in a bilateral fashion to have equal relations with each individual country rather than dealing with a U.S.-dominated bloc. So it is part of Obama's horrendous so-called Asia pivot strategy, and it is essentially a threat of war against the Chinese. Same with the Russians. This is a threat regarding Russia's policy and position in support of the rebels in eastern Ukraine. It is a direct threat against Russian interests in what is now
Eric,
Russian Crimea.
We're going to have to move on because we want to talk a little bit in the program with Raul Castro's speech in the UN. He has called for the end of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade against his country, the return of the territory illegally occupied by the Guantanamo naval base, the U.S. naval base, the cessation of radio and TV broadcast and of subversion and destabilization programs against Cuba, This is pretty important since the U.S. beats its chest about the normalization of relations with Cuba, which sounds more like the normalization of imperialism in Cuba. So quickly, your comments. We only have about a minute left.
I would simply say that what Raul Castro is essentially saying is the same thing that Fidel Castro has said for a number of decades, namely that any normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States will have to take place on an equal footing. There will not be one imperial power dictating to a smaller island nation what its policy should be, how the trade should go, how Cuba should run its internal affairs. Number one demand of removing U.S. forces from Guantanamo Bay, in other words, erasing the legacy and the continued legacy and continued occupation of an imperial force. More to the point, Cuba needs normalization on an equal footing. That's what Castro is demanding.
We have to, Caleb, you have the last word in about half.
All right, we should be all watching Latin America very closely right now. The U.S. is desperately trying to destabilize Venezuela and harm the people there by keeping the oil prices low and funding fascist dissident movements there. We should all be watching Latin America very closely in the next few months because the struggle for freedom and independence is going to really escalate there shortly, I believe.
And that does it for Behind the News, the World, right here on WBAI.